they misfired with this Epstein stuff, because the two things that the right care about are state capture by a foreign entity and pedophilia. And he's like, okay, well, this is the whole enchilada here, you know? And so there's no coming back from this. There's no coming back from this. It's so undignified. There should be something called shame. They're like a tiger that's tasted human flesh. They're like, you're like, okay, go in the wilderness and eat some rabbits. They're like, no, we need the humans. They've tasted power. They want power. That's all it is. That's all it is.
Hello and welcome to Attrition. I am Ammar Kazmi, the host of this new show where we'll be looking at war, imperialism, Zionism, and discussing how we can remedy these global ills. I'm really pleased to be joined today for my debut episode with Dr. Ashok Kumar. Dr. Ashok is a lecturer. He's also the author of Monopsony Capitalism, as well as numerous academic papers, articles, and he's also a member of the Historical Materialism Journal's editorial collective. So thank you very much for joining me today, Ashok.
Thanks for having me, Ammar.
And just to give our viewers a bit of context about who you are, beyond what I've already said, I mean, you're someone with quite an interesting background. You're obviously of South Indian heritage. Your grandparents were imprisoned for their anti-colonial organizing during the British Raj. You grew up in Chicago. You've held elected office in Wisconsin. So you have that US background, but you've also, of course, been working in academia in Britain for many, many years. And you've had your finger to the pulse on numerous leftist political movements, not just in Britain, but across different countries. So your global outlook is rather unique. And I say all of that because I want to start by asking you about the left. So to many people, the left is this some kind of blob which vaguely believes in, redistributing wealth and social liberalism, although that's also debatable. But if you looked at leftist movements in South India, I'd assume that they're quite different in terms of their culture, ethos, outlook to, let's say, the British left. So what actually is the left? What do we mean by the left? And could you speak about your experiences in different countries?
Well, thanks for that introduction, Ammar. Yeah, I think so. Across the 20th century, there was a real debate about what is the left. And these debates were hashed out, obviously, prior to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918, and then afterwards throughout the course of the 20th century. And so the debate really, and you see this sort of replicate itself over and over again in different situations and environments. Ultimately, at its base level, it's a question of how does change happen? That the left, at least, the left of the last 150 years prior to that period, of course, there were different iterations, but since the emergence of what we call capitalism, a mode of production, where effectively everything is mediated through the market, that we are no longer living off the land and under a feudal system. We're a system in which we have to sell our labor time in order to sustain ourselves, to have a roof over our shoulders or feed our children. So under that system, it's a system of it's highly exploitative, but it's also very unifying. Peasant societies couldn't really unite across borders because they had different tenant regimes, property regimes, but also different demands. And whereas under capitalism, it is something that can unite. So you see the emergence of a kind of international tendency of what it means to be the left, what's their relationship to other countries, but also imperialism. So when you're a country that is a victim of imperialism, somewhere like India or across the global south, the politics that you prioritize potentially as the left, or should prioritize, is very different from being in the sort of imperial core, somewhere like Britain and America. Saying that, ultimately, at its foundation, much of the left has been in a debate between revolutionary politics and reformist politics. And it's kind of a continuum. It's not either or, but it's been a continuum. And that, to a large extent, has divided much of the Indian left, right? So you had sort of the Communist Party in India, which is the original formation. And then during the sort of popular fronts of the 1940s, the Soviet Popular Front, I mean, they were obviously very linked to the Soviet Union. And so there was a strategy of a Popular Front, which said, okay, it sort of shifts from the 1930s to the 1940s, where they say, we're fighting fascism, work with liberal parties and social democratic parties. And so what you find is that the Communist Party in India then basically aligns themselves with the sort of Nehruvian bourgeois state Congress party. That's the dominant party in India. And so by the mid-1960s, you see real fissures happening, and the Communist Party Marxists emerge out of the sort of Sino-Soviet, the Chinese and Russian split in the early 1960s. They emerge and they say, we need to have more revolutionary politics. And then you also have the Communist Party Marxist-Leninists, who are more sort of Maoist in the orientation, that says we need armed struggle. So at one end, you have much more sort of what you saw revolutionary politics of like against the state and against the bourgeois parties, which is the Communist Party Marxist-Leninists. And then you have the Communist Party Marxists, who are somewhere between the Communist Party India and Communist Party Marxist-Leninists. And then you have the Communist Party India, which is much more reformist. And so that basically determines much of the Indian political left. And you see similar kind of iterations, I think, in the US. You see much more reformist political parties, and you see parties that are much more marginal, that are revolutionary, that have a much more antagonistic relationship to them. So ultimately, the question is, there's a form, content, and demands question. And I think what unites all of these different factions is that they believe that we need to upend the existing political, economic, and social order, which is capitalism. And that is, some of them, most of them, especially if they're from a Marxist orientation rather than, say, like an anarchist or a primitivist or whatever kind of orientation, which I would also say are part of the left, believe that we shouldn't regress to some kind of feudal or primitive or tribal society, but that we should progress beyond capitalism, that we accumulate value through capitalism, value, not social value, but economic value. And in that way, we're able to often say own the means of production, that these means of production are produced and then we can then own it. And so it's a question of how you get there. And that's where the divisions have
Is it a question of how you get there? Because, I mean, to what extent does the left in Britain, for example, or the United States, or even many other countries, want to actually progress beyond capitalism as opposed to just maintaining and regulating capitalism?
Yeah. Okay. So I think that it's about intentions, and what they articulate as intentions, and what you see in practice. And I can only go by what is intended. And I think if people say this is what we want to do, like even if you look at, for example, the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and Zohran Mamdani in New York, as just an example. Very reformist. You know, it's like middle of the road social democratic demands, even like kind of not even middle of the road, not even left social democratic demands, which are like free buses and childcare and a few publicly owned grocery stores. Those demands, you know, if you read and see some of the things he said before, he's like, ultimately the goal is that we have socialism, which is we socialize the means of production, which, you know, you have the sort of abolishment of private profit as a motive that motivates society. He's articulated that. Now, do we think necessarily that this is the means to get there? Like, I think that's debatable, because there was obviously revolutionary politics, and then there's reformist politics, and these debates were happening very fiercely in the 1950s, in the post-war period. And then in the 1960s, you had this French Trotskyist, André Gorz, who wrote a text called Strategy for Labor. It's a little, he later wrote Farewell to the Working Class, but this is a pamphlet that was written that he says, there isn't this division between reformism, where you're just involved in the state and blah, 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 and doing reforms, and then, or revolutionary politics. They said that there's a kind of middle ground, which is what he called non-reformist reforms versus reformist reform. So a non-reformist reform is a reform that decommodifies essential parts of the society. And if we see a struggle between labor and capital as a war of attrition, then that war requires that we erode the power of capital. It's an asymmetrical war. So asymmetrical wars, often the weaker party has to have a war of attrition, and the stronger party has a war of annihilation. In the war of attrition against capital, how do we go about actually defeating that? And it's about weakening the power of capital. So let's say you're a state, and the state has private property owners that have a lot of state capture. They capture the state. They have elected officials in their pockets, whatever. And they have the media in their pocket, and they have hegemony, right? Cultural hegemony. What Gramsci calls cultural hegemony, would control the levers of both culture and production. Then what you do is you push the state, for example, to decommodify parts of housing. So then you weaken the power of state, and you've built in an infrastructure, a kind of power of people that can unite in their own interest to preserve public housing. That's just an example. I'm not necessarily
just to take that example. I mean, does the left get lost in a kind of parochialism in terms of focusing purely on domestic issues rather than looking at international issues? Because of course, if we're talking about a war of attrition against capitalism, then of course you have to have a war of attrition against imperialism, which is the expression of capitalism in the global sphere, which is this ruthless accumulation of resources through force and through coercion, which is predominantly led by the United States of America today. But the problem, it seems to me, is that the left, especially in the West, isn't entirely focused or doesn't really have a proper answer for how we can combat imperialism. So does that not make the left sort of irrelevant in the struggle against imperialism and actually, by extension, capitalism?
Well, look, I think it's a question of so there is a kind of a left that says, which I think is completely wrong. Typically, Trotskyists will say this. I mean, I think there's lots of parts of Trotsky that I really like, but I think Trotsky the person, how Nietzsche says, the last true Christian died on the cross. Well, I think the last true Trotskyists died under suspicious circumstances. So I think for me, the question of that question of what the left in the global north or the imperial core, are they making inroads on the question of imperialism? There is a self-interest. There is a self-interest. This isn't about privilege politics, because I actually don't think, to a large extent, largely that, vast numbers of white people, for example, lose out because of the existence of race. I think some people benefit, but I think with imperialism, they're extracting enormous amounts of resources. There is a reason why Americans can borrow to the hilt, and even individual Americans can borrow to the hilt. It's because the American dollar is the reserve currency. So the American state can borrow to the hilt, and we all pay for it. That's imperialism. So there is a direct benefit as a result of that. There's a reason why there's robust welfare states in imperial countries, and even the left can have robust welfare states in the global south and can't even demand that, because they extracted value and then they distributed a proportion of that value to its subjects, right? So there's a buy-in there. There's a class compromise, you could say. And so there's an interest for the West and their subjects, both hegemonically, which they're taught to think there's an interest, and materially, right? This kind of labor aristocracy that benefits from that extractive process. And so there's a real hurdle of trying to, if there's not a hurdle to convince immigrants from the global south, who are also basically the working class, who are often the least beneficiaries of that imperial order, even in terms of distribution. But there's a massive hurdle to try and convince, both culturally, because they're like, oh, we need to be dominant. There's a kind of psychological wage of whiteness, for example, in which they're like, we're this dominant. It's libidinal. They're like, yes, we're dominating. We're great. Yes, my children are hungry. I'm eating out of a garbage can and I'm living on the street, but I've got this sense of power. I mean, you see this even in the emergence of Theodore Allen, wrote this book called The Invention of Whiteness. And in that book, it's a very important book, says, how was whiteness created? And he articulates that, in the southern tobacco fields, in the new colonies in Virginia, you had all these different populations coming there, working as indentured servants, being exploited heavily by a small section of, they didn't even identify as Europeans, because Europeans were at each other's throats for literally thousands of years, or at least hundreds of years. Or they didn't identify as whites because there was no conception of whiteness. But then there was no state even. There was a retrenched state. So what happened was people, 300, 400 people to one landowner. So then they were like, okay, finally there's, people are like fighting back. And so there was this creation of whiteness. And that whiteness meant that you had these landowners give what they identified as whites, small, most like unproductive parts of land, gave them a badge, gave them a mule, gave them some authority. And fast forward to the 1860s, and these same whites are fighting and dying in the mud for a system that dispossesses them from any ability to be laborers and accumulate any kind of ability to sustain themselves and subsist. So they're dying in the mud for a system that oppresses them as well. So for me, there is that element, of course, but there's also a material benefit for these people, for a lot of people to continue imperialism. I mean, the erosion of the welfare state really from the 1980s onwards does make the possibilities to open up an anti-imperialist left much more likely, but then also the erosion of an internationalism that existed prior to this.
This is an important point as well, because I think one of the issues is, and you may disagree, is an ideological hangover and a defect in that ideology, which results in a chauvinism, not necessarily across the whole world, but particularly on the British left and the US left and in various Western countries, where people have not recalibrated their understanding from sort of the 20th century, where it was sort of socialist and communist movements who were primarily involved, revolutionary ones, who were involved in pioneering decolonization across the world. And so you had this process of decolonization, but then actually when the Soviet Union fell in 1991 and you had this defanging of communism across the entire world, actually in terms of methods and influence, the left across the world was dealt, I think, a pretty fatal blow. You may not say it's fatal, but a pretty large blow.
Oh, I agree, absolutely. Nearly fatal. I mean, we're on life support right now.
And so what has emerged in the meantime is, if you look especially in West Asia, you look at who is leading the meaningful material resistance against Zionism and by extension imperialism in the world today. It is Muslim resistance groups.
Yeah, okay.
But people on the West left I've experienced will stop short of supporting them, not just for fear of, being called a terrorist or something, but because they just think, well, these are just so-called Islamists. We don't want anything to do with them because they don't believe in our social liberalism or whatever. Yeah. And also, which I think is to a lesser extent, there are those who say, well, as Marxists, we can't really align ourselves with these religious people. Religion is an opiate of the masses. But I think that in itself is a misreading and a misunderstanding, because Marxism, I think, being quite Eurocentric, at least among its sort of progenitors, or like obviously Marx, Lenin, they had a conception of religion which was very top-down, which still exists in the world today, by the way, of course, and exists in the Muslim world as well, exists in places like Saudi Arabia, where you have this top-down religion, but the religion is actually a way of controlling people. But that doesn't account for a kind of a more revolutionary religion that, rather than telling people, look, just leave it all to the rulers, they know what they're doing, you'll get a better world in the afterlife, don't focus on doing anything now. There's the counterpose view, which is that actually we have to, kind of in a Marxist way, like we have to create a utopia on earth, we have to do our best to fight for justice now, even if that means sacrificing our lives. But I don't think this is actually accounted for. So you have, on the one hand, an ideological misunderstanding where people who are involved in Islamic resistance in West Asia are so committed to the cause of freedom and decolonization that they're willing to give up their lives, which is not understood. And then you also have this sort of chauvinism, racism, supremacism that means that, well, we can't align with these people because they differ with us on certain views. Does that not make the left in the West especially quite irrelevant in terms of being able to meaningfully support, let's say, de-Zionization or the liberation of Palestinians?
Well, there's a lot there. Okay, so I think firstly, of course there are people on the left who say this. I think it's, to be honest, I think it's a bit of a dated thing. I think certainly people who are an older generation, 80s, who cut their teeth in the 70s and 80s and whatever, had this very reductive conception of religion. But it also comes from the fact that at that time, you had a bona fide left in much of West Asia that was, you could say, secular. And they were antagonistic against religious forces. Not all. I think we have to disarticulate, obviously, different iterations of Islam in the region without getting into that. I think there were some elements that were directly financed and armed by Western imperial forces exactly to crush the left. And so if you've cut your teeth, I don't want to take away from, cut your teeth in that history, then you naturally see religious forces in West Asia as people that aren't your allies. So I think for me, my experience with people who are not in that older generation necessarily is that there is a very kind of direct line, even liberal. Let's just take direct examples without speaking in vagaries, like the DSA. The DSA is very explicit. Look, DSA isn't my politics, but even the DSA, which is very mainstream, which is about to become the mayor of the biggest, most important city in the world, in the imperial core and across the world, is explicitly supports BDS and will not support any candidate that doesn't. I mean, of course, they're shaky on some people like AOC and others, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but still has maintained a pretty rigid line on this question. And that's precisely because of the anti-imperial forces within it, which is a younger generation. I mean, I would say Corbyn, despite all the criticism, did, I think on the anti-Semitism stuff, all that stuff, he really fumbled. He was attacked precisely because of his politics around the imperial question in Palestine, and he was destroyed because of that. I don't think that was I disagree with some people about whether it was anti-Semitism that was the reason why he lost. I think that was one of the tools that was used, but it was because of Palestine and imperialism that he was attacked with everything, and that's why he was they had to destroy him as a result of that. So I think when we say the left, there is this, what it means, and I think it's important to be a bit dialectical here. It's not that the left has influence. The left is trying to understand the material conditions and sharpen the contradictions and bend the stick, as Cliff says, to try and really understand what's happening and see what we can push and where we can push it. We can say all kinds of things, but the material conditions in the population might be here, and we're out here in the wilderness ranting and raving and howling at the moon, and that doesn't mean anything, right? So it's like, I think we have to sharpen it, we have to push it, but I think to at the best of its ability, decapitated, disemboweled left is still maintaining, I think, as a consistent line. I'll just tell you this: if organizations that are more, let's say, without getting into the weeds of left idiosyncratic language, more imperialist in their Trotskyism, for example, are completely marginal and aggressively and actively marginalized, at least in Britain and the US, certainly not in Germany, where you have anti-Deutsch, which are culturally and in many ways dominant. But even in the French left, like they've consistently, I'm talking about like the La France Insoumise and Mélenchon, has consistently pushed back on this and has taken one of the strongest lines on the question of imperialism and that we've seen in decades.
Well, I think that's true. I also think Mélenchon, just going on that, he's been on a bit of a journey, I would say. As well.
Oh, absolutely.
And La France Insoumise as well, actually.
Absolutely.
Because I think they probably did have a slightly more chauvinistic line towards Muslims in France when they first started out. But actually, I will commend Mélenchon and La France Insoumise in the sense that they have a very strong in support of Palestine and in terms of, material anti-Zionist action.
But even, just to say on that, even if you look at Zohran Mamdani, he never conceded the ground on, even though he's been attacked continuously.
Well, I want to get onto Mamdani a bit later.
Okay, fine.
But just before we get into that, I mean, and it's kind of circling back a little bit to where we were before. You were talking about the left in India. We want to know, I guess, how they have been working to inhibit the genocide, because obviously India, as a state today, not in the past, but today, it certainly has a really close relationship with the Zionist regime. It's the largest arms purchaser. They have broader military cooperation as well. And of course, very famously, they have this army of online trolls that are incessantly supporting Israel, even claiming to be Israelis living there, going to bomb shelters, even though they're probably safe somewhere in Delhi. But that isn't the whole picture, obviously, because India is a collection of, let's say, of polities, right? And there's different sort of political movements there. And there has actually been a lot of work, especially by the left in India, to try to inhibit the genocide. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, yeah, I think that this is an important thing that people should understand. India is like not dissimilar to the European Union in the sense that it's a linguistic states. You have languages in different parts, different cultures, different cuisines that are fundamentally different from each other. And just as an example, like Hindi, which is spoken in the north, despite what anyone would say that is the national language, it's not a national language. We have 22 national languages, 23 national languages. It's similar in terms of its language to English than it is to the southern languages, which are Dravidian languages. And I'm from the south, and Dravidian languages are like Tamil, Malayalam, Kannada, Telugu. Those are in the southern states. So it's important to draw that distinction. I'll get to that in a minute, but just to say the history for a minute, India voted against the partition plan when in the formation of Israel. India didn't recognize Israel initially. They only had consular recognition until 1992. They were the first non-Arab country to recognize Palestine. They were the first non-Arab country to recognize the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. They consistently had this policy of non-alignment. They were the leaders in the non-aligned movement, and so they were very hostile and antagonistic towards Israel. Their main sort of adversary, I guess, Pakistan, was effectively a vassal state of the Americans for much of the latter half of the 20th century. So, and was a kind of a ground for anti-communist kind of military organizing, you could say, across West Asia and across South Asia. But India saying that, it wasn't all the BJP. They sort of, the ambassador relationship begins in 1992, and then they do their first military deal in 1998. That was under a Congress-led, that's a sort of center-left government, in 1998. And it really accelerates from 2014 onwards with Modi. And Modi represents the sort of Hindu fascist kind of government that is still in power now. Saying that, because it's states and it's a federated system, the Hindu fascists have really no ground in the South. They have no control in the South, the southern states. The southern states are, if India's like this, I guess for audio listeners, it doesn't make any sense. It's divided by the Hindu Kush Mountains, and the southern states are Karnataka, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Andhra, and Telangana, which is a more recent state. But in those states, in Tamil Nadu, it's led by this chief minister M.K. Stalin, who is in it's a coalition government. It's led by a group called DMK, which is historically part of the Dravida Kazhagam movement, which was the movement that was basically kind of the Dravida movement, which was anti-North Hindi imposition, Hindu fascism, was anti-Hindu actually in lots of ways, because they said Hinduism is an imposition on us. Historically, Hinduism is a construction in the sense that we had these vast movements and struggles and indigenous struggles in the global south, in the southern part of India, and you had the Aryan invasion thousands of years ago, and with that came the imposition of caste and came the imposition of Hinduism and their gods and the Vedic scriptures. And even if you look now, there's two big epics in India, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And the Ramayana, which is based on the fascist movement, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement of destroying the Babri Masjid mosque. I'm going through this very quickly because there's a lot of details. The whole basis of that is a story of this prince, this pure prince, Rama, whose pure wife is kidnapped by a 10-headed Rakshasa, monster, demon from Lanka, what is Sri Lanka, and he has to travel through the south. That's the story. It's a sort of journey of him and his brother, Lakshmana, going through the south, and they don't come across any humans. They only come across monkeys and demons. And that is an allegory for the Aryan invasion, because it was the monkeys were the allied tribes and the Rakshasas were the antagonistic tribes. So we're Rakshasas. We're the Rakshasas. We're not going to be demonized. And so there was a movement. It was a massive movement, and that movement is still very strong, and they have control in that state, and it's a coalition with the Communist Party, India, and Communist Party Marxists. In Kerala, since 1957, it was the first democratically elected communist government in the world, and it was led by this man, EMS Namboodiripad in Kerala, still remains led by the Communist Party Marxists, and the Congress Party leads in Karnataka, which is like a left government Congress. It's not communist, but it's like the left of the Congress Party. And so that, when you look at what happened after the genocide began, there was in Kerala, there was the main producer, for example, of the police uniforms immediately. They made 100,000 a year. I mean, we're not an
What was this
imperialist
police
country.
uniform thing? Sorry.
Oh, they were making uniforms for the police in Israel. Sorry. And we have to make a distinction. We're not an imperialist country, and we haven't been an imperialist country. We're a poor country. India's a poor country. So in order to cut off, to do sort of BDS against country, it's a big step, right? So they stopped producing it entirely on political grounds. And they had marches of millions of people, actually, in Kerala and other places. And the chief minister was explicitly saying Israel's a terrorist state. This is a genocide. We stand in solidarity with the Palestinians. And even the main union of port workers in India said they would refuse to move weaponized cargo. That they were primarily in Kochi in Kerala, but also in Tamil Nadu. But they represented 11 major ports in India. And then you also had the M.K. Stalin, leader of Tamil Nadu, condemning Israel. Huh?
No relation, of course.
No relation. But yes, they come from the historic left, right? That his father was also chief minister in Tamil Nadu.
And just to talk about that, I mean, of course, that was quite a major action, the Water Transport Workers Federation, and their decision to not load arms bound for the Zionist regime onto those ships. But I think this is a good segue into something else I want to discuss with you, because the reason why they were, of course, doing that, and the reason why Indian ports have been of interest in terms of trying to inhibit the genocide, is because the Ansarullah of Yemen, of course, launched a blockade in the Red Sea, which massively disrupted commercial shipping and devastated ports in Haifa, and obviously stopped loads of goods reaching the Zionist regime. But in order to try to counteract that, they then tried to, and they did make a land corridor to Israel by having ships dock in India, then transporting them to the United Arab Emirates, and then having a land corridor from the UAE to Israel. So obviously they had to figure out this land corridor because there was this major disruption. So could you talk a bit about why Ansarullah's blockade was so economically devastating and effective?
Yeah, so on the land, to begin with the land corridor, I mean, with the Water Transport Workers Union, who represented workers in 11 of the 12 major ports, these are in India, they have 56 minor ports. So the major ports are what matters, and I'll get to why that's relevant to Ansarullah more directly in a minute. But Adani, who's the richest man in India, Gautam Adani, he had a joint venture where he was producing drones that were flying and bombing Gaza and like directly involved in the genocide. He was producing that in Hyderabad, which is a southern state, but it's and they were those parts were being in a joint venture produced there, being transported by Adani to Mundra port, which is the only major private port. It's in Gujarat, which is arguably the most reactionary state, and the state where Modi was leader and led a genocide of his own in 2002, 2003. But that was then they're transported there. Mundra port is jointly owned by Adani. Then it's transported by ship to UAE, client state. Then UAE moves it by land through various client states to Israel. But Haifa port also is a joint venture owned by Adani. So the integration of the Indian state in Israel is very deep and wide, you could say.
But that's quite interesting, because I think one of the criticisms that has been leveled at these online trolls is, well, you're just sort of begging for a relationship with Israel that they don't really want with you. You're saying how much you support Israel and you love Israeli women, all this sort of stuff that you have these trolls doing. But actually, there is a deep integration between the Indian and the Zionist state, which is materially important in the genocide of Palestinians.
Yeah, look, I'll be honest with you. When I was in India recently, and I was kind of involved with the transport worker stuff 2 years ago when it happened, or a year and a half ago when it happened. But this time recently, 3 months ago, we were trying to work with the Hind Rajab's Foundation to find these war criminals that were vacationing in India. And they do this after they've done 2 years of, killing. They come to India and they go, I'm a hippie now. And then, so we were trying to do these cases. And these lawyers, left-wing lawyers who I was working with to try and put these cases forward, because we have an international jurisdiction law from 1960 in India, and they're terrified because the Indian state will white van you, put you in a hole, and there's very little accountability. But it really depends on the state. So in Kerala, and maybe this is an indication of something, not a lot of them go to Kerala. It's a very big tourist spot, but not a lot of these war criminals go to Kerala. But some of them come to Karnataka, and none of them go to Tamil Nadu. So we were trying to focus really on Karnataka and try to get them. But people were very scared because it's so integrated with the state, and they're so beneficial in lots of ways to the state, the Indian state, that they would come down really hard because it's an economic question as well. So I think I also want to point out that the ideology of the far right, the Hindu fascists in India, which is a Nazi ideology. I mean, the RSS, which is the most sort of more extreme of that coalition, which, Modi was a field organizer for decades. There's a story basically that I met an old comrade who was organizing in Gujarat in the 1960s, and I was at this camp in Kerala a few years ago, and he was telling the story. He'd had a few drinks, and he was like, "Yeah, back in the 60s, I was a young man, and I was doing the field organizing because there'd been a fascist attack in Gujarat. It hadn't been full-blown fascist at that point." And he was like trying to get people to come to this meeting, and he was setting up, and he was in a town, and this young boy would come there, and he came the first day, and he's like, "Oh, you've never been part of the left, have you? We always start like an hour late or something." So he has a tea with him, and he gets to know him, and he was like, he would help him set up every time. Years later, he's on TV, and he sees it, and it's Modi, and he's been sent by the RSS. RSS has these basically chalets, these places where people live, young people live, and they take care of the older people, and it's kind of, and then they organize full time. And he had been sent as a spy, and that was Modi. And Modi had been in the RSS since he was a young teenager. And so the RSS, historically, they were the ones that worked with the British. The right worked with the British as collaborators to point out and to attack the left, and to get the left to be kidnapped by the colonial state and tortured and killed and thrown into penal colonies. They were the ones who were the collaborators. So it's not, people are like, "Oh, you're siding with the colonizer." I'm like, they've always sided with the colonizer. They always sided with the colonizer because their biggest enemy was the left, and their biggest enemies were Muslims. And so to them, they're like, they feel heartened by what's happening in Gaza, because they're like, that's what we can do to Kashmiris. That's what we can do to Muslims here. And so there's a direct economic and ideological drive here. It's but yes, to go to Ansar Allah, firstly, the heroism and the sacrifices, it's just no words can describe what they've done. But then the question becomes, how were they successful? I mean, this is the first example in history of a state, organization, whatever, that has successfully instituted a naval blockade without a standing navy. I mean, militaries are expensive. Navies are the most expensive part of any military historically. And naval blockades are only accomplished by the most advanced militaries, right? And because they're so expensive, they're resource intensive, you need supply lines that are continuous, etc. And the reason they were able to do it was threefold. It's because of a geographic choke point, in part, because the Bab al-Mandeb Strait is very narrow, and it's the connection between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. And so it's this crucial choke point in global trade. 30% of all container ships travel through there, 12% of all oil and gas, so it's a huge choke point that is potential for high disruption. The second point is that they had access to domestically produced ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. Some of them were dual use, that they purchased from China and that were transported through Oman, and then they sort of recalibrated them as primarily surveillance drones. But the second part was that direct support from Iran was able to make and produce basically a bunker buster proof deep underground facility in Saida, and there they were able to produce these sort of domestically produced drones and missiles. And so because of that, they were able to attack quite effectively. And the last part is because of the changing composition of maritime capitalism. And there's a sort of underlying law of motion that Marx describes in Volume 1 of Capital, which is one of competition. That intensity of competition leads to centralization. So the consolidation of the shipping industry, which now basically 9 or 10 shipping companies and 3 alliances control 90% of all shipping, global shipping. And that's resulted in very efficient production processes, massive ships. So for example, in the 1980s, they had the largest ship was 4,500 TEUs. That's 20 equivalent unit. That's basically a unit measure for shipping containers, how much they can carry. Now it's 5 times that. And those ships are massive because they're more efficient, and you have higher profits. And these alliances mean that you can be very efficient. You have low slack. Slack is the amount of space you have for any delays. The slack is very slim. So that's highly profitable, but it means that disruptions have reverberating effects across the supply chain. It also means that, for example, historically, Israel, so-called, had 6 ports that goods can come out of in the 70s and 80s. That now it's basically 2 deep water ports, one at Ashdod and one at Haifa, and then 3 sort of what you call sort of commercial hub ports. And that was Eilat, which is the only one that's tied to the Red Sea, and Ashdod and Haifa. Eilat basically declares bankruptcy because of the Red Sea blockade. They're able to stop them continuously because they're sending these missiles, and it's no longer commercially viable for Maersk or other major firms, shipping firms, to transport the goods because the liabilities went through the roof. Liabilities means typically it would be sort of 0.1% of the goods of a shipping container would be paid into insurance. It shot up to 2%. That's 2,000% increase, right? That's a massive. When you have relatively low margins and you're intensely competitive, it's a massive upshot. So they instead took the hit and said, okay, we're going to transport around. We're going to go back to by 150 years before the Suez was built and transport around Southern Africa. Increased by 2 weeks. That increases oil prices, increase costs in terms of transport, in terms of crew, in terms of everything, in order to get it to Israel and get it to Europe, etc. So you had a massive impact across the supply chain. Goods go up, inflation could shoot up, loads of factors involved in this. And because of the consolidation of these systems, it meant that these massive ships over time could only dock in these deep water ports. Because the draft, which is where the front of the ship hits the bottom of the hull, the draft increases as these ships become bigger and bigger. And there's only a few ports that can absorb them. And so because it's only Eilat, Ashdod, and Haifa, as soon as Eilat is shut down, the capacity becomes bigger and bigger in Haifa and Ashdod. And because of that, you see Hezbollah were attacking Haifa continuously. You saw Iran responding to Israel's aggression, attacking Haifa and successfully hitting Haifa. And it's important to remember the reason why, and this is in the Levy report from 2024, the reason why Israel begins to create their missile defense system for short-term missiles, which is the Iron Dome, longer-term missiles, obviously, David Sling, others. But for short-term missiles was precisely because they said it was a horror scenario, inverted commas, horror scenario of what happened in 2006 when Hezbollah successfully defeated the entity and attacked Haifa. And because they attacked Haifa and were able to shut down Haifa, they were like, this is a horror scenario. We have to stop this. Because Israel is essentially an island state. 99.6% of all its goods in and out are seaborne. And because of that, that's a crucial liability. And so that's why when Iran consciously and deliberately attacked Haifa, major shipping companies like Maersk said we are no longer, and they're the main shipping company that transports arms to Israel, said that we're going to move to Ashdod. Ashdod doesn't have nearly the capacity of Haifa. So you have this massive backlog, very low slack. They have to wait to dock their ships. So these increase the liability to the state. And so the impacts of what happened, what the Ansar Allah have been able to successfully do, even in defeating the imperialist forces. So you had this coalition of 20 countries, 6 of them that didn't even want to be named. The mission was called Prosperity Guardian. That was done under Biden. Totally unsuccessful, because you have these huge, like massive fleets, expensive, transporters, etc. And you have these movable rebels. Historically, the problem with rebel armies and major armies that in that asymmetry is that the question of distance. So if you look at the forces, the revolutionary forces in Vietnam, for example, they're very dynamic. They can move around. But the problem is they can't make up distance. They have to come very close because they don't have air power. And so that's where the liabilities are. Whereas here, they can make up that distance because they have these now more affordable technologies and because of the help they got from Iran. So so they weren't able to defeat them. And then it's more indicative of this, and that's why in many ways Trump is more useful as a kind of against imperialism than someone like Biden. Trump didn't even try to get a coalition together. Of course, their lapdog Britain followed suit. Probably he didn't even ask them to, and he did. Starmer did. But they also were defeated. And it's very clear in the New York Times piece that came out in April, very, very clear. The Pentagon was like, we've sent $1 billion in a very short period of time and had almost no impact on Ansar Allah because they were so dynamic. And we're losing all of our missiles. We don't have enough strategic precision-guided missiles in case something happens with China and Taiwan. They say this explicitly. So that's why that was very clearly a defeat. And Trump signs that agreement without even speaking to Israel. It's very clear that he did that. So long story short, Ansar Allah were successful because of their commitment and solidarity and a revolutionary consciousness, but also because they were able to see the changing material conditions of maritime capitalism and exploit them very efficaciously.
Well, I think it's a deeply materialist outlook to warfare and understanding the world as it evolves, because, asymmetrical warfare has a capacity to do real damage in certain situations, I think. It doesn't work everywhere. So you saw in Lebanon how the rules changed and how actually Hezbollah and actually just the people of South Lebanon were absorbing lots and lots of hits in a way they never had done before. It was completely unprecedented, but then not really being able to land too much back. Of course, it still resulted in this sort of tenuous ceasefire, which is continuously being broken, but they had to absorb lots and lots of hits as a result. Same with Iran, of course. Iran had to absorb lots of hits on Tehran. While they were still making hits on the entity, they were still absorbing a lot. So it's like this asymmetrical warfare means that people have to take lots and lots of damage, because if they can't make up that distance, as you were saying, it's very difficult to land a real blow on the enemy. With Ansar Allah kind of uniquely positioned because of the fact they are in that location. So it's the geography there that helps them, but also this materialist outlook, this sort of commitment that makes them want to act in that way.
Yeah, and I think also, and I mean, you might disagree with this, I think it's also a relationship to Iran. I think that Hezbollah has a much more direct relationship to Iran. Iran has loads of different conservative, liberal, orthodox, unorthodox interests, let's say, that determine their geopolitical strategy. And that is then imposed in a much more direct way with Hezbollah. I think with Ansar Allah, it's not a direct result. They're not, people call Hezbollah a proxy. I mean, Israel's America's proxy in lots of ways, and America's Israel's proxy increasingly. So I think it's like, I'm not going to call it a proxy, but I think there's a much more direct relationship. But with Ansar Allah, they're like, you can support us or not support us. We're going to stand with the people of Palestine, no matter what, with whatever we have. And they say that explicitly. And they criticize Iran openly when they're not acting in the interests more directly and more confrontationally and responding to the belligerence and the violence and the genocidal intent of Israel. So it's very clear because of that I remember it's probably the most beautiful articulation when a member of Ansar Allah said when Israel and Britain bombed Hadaya port, the main port in Yemen. He says, Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah. There is effectively this is proof that there is a God, because you have allowed us to absorb this bomb that was supposed to land to the people of Gaza. And it's probably the most beautiful articulation of solidarity that I've ever witnessed in my life. And it's that kind of resolve. So it's not just the material conditions, it's the subjective agency of people to be like, there's something more than just my life, my people, my family, my tribe. There's a sense of global internationalism that we haven't seen really for a very, very long time, or maybe ever.
I completely agree on the question of that posture as well. And of course, they did put out these sort of barbs to the Islamic Republic when it came to what they considered their sort of lack of speedy action. I mean, Iran, I think, is far more democratic than people in the West think it is.
Yeah.
They just think it's Ayatollah Khamenei at the top and he's directing everything, and it's the IRGC, and they just decide exactly what they want to do. Whereas actually, because it is so democratic internally, in many ways, in a different way to the West, obviously, but because it has that internal democracy, it's not just like the supreme leader gives a diktat and says, we have to strike Israel because of what they've done, and then
Of course.
the rest of the state follows suit. It doesn't happen like that. So you saw that with True Promise too. So there is that dynamism there with the Ansarullah, because obviously they are a different political movement in various ways. I wouldn't say that Hezbollah has a more direct relationship with Iran and that's why they behave in that way. I think Hezbollah also has these other considerations, because also they're sort of a factor within the Lebanese state. I mean, until very recently, they're part of the Lebanese government, right? Which is inconceivable to people in the West, because it's just a terrorist organization.
Yeah.
But, you know, you have the political wing, you have the military wing, you know, you have Hezbollah MPs.
I mean, to be clear, they weren't even designated as a terrorist organization until 2018 in Britain, and they were designated as a terrorist organization. Let's be very clear, as a direct way to attack Jeremy Corbyn,
which is stunning as well.
I mean, it's very clear, and we know this also from what's written afterwards. It was explicit that that was the reason why they were designated. There was nothing going on at 2018.
Well, I would say that,
or maybe you disagree.
Because no, I think it's true. But the problem is that Jeremy Corbyn, because of his indulgence of the anti-Semitism smear campaign,
I agree,
he created this febrile atmosphere in which it was possible for someone like Sajid Javid to just go along with the United States and say, yeah, we're going to prescribe Hezbollah. In that period, you had the US and the Israel lobby across various Western countries, Austria, France, Germany, and at the European Union level more broadly, and of course in Britain, pushing for the political wing of Hezbollah to be prescribed. Yeah. And it happened, of course, in those other countries first, but the reason I think it happened in Britain was precisely because we left that space open and there's no room to challenge. Well, does it make sense diplomatically, even just from a diplomatic perspective, that we prescribe an organization that is part of a government of another country with which we have diplomatic relations, by the way, and for which Lebanese citizens in this country can vote for at the Lebanese embassy in London?
Yeah,
but anyway,
wild.
To turn to a slightly different picture, although maybe not according to his enemies, I want to talk about Zohran Mamdani. We're going to circle back now. Of course,
we're bringing it back home.
We're bringing it back. So, I mean, he just, of course, won the Democratic primary. People think he's actually the mayor of New York City now for some reason, but he's just won the primary. People are getting a bit ahead of themselves. There's still
he's effectively the mayor.
Well, okay, but he's won the primary.
It's like winning the nomination for the Labour Party in London, really.
Well, that doesn't make you prime minister.
No, but if you're running for mayor of London and you win the Labour Party primary or whatever it is, that I don't know what they call it here, then you're effectively the mayor.
Okay, so let's say he's the incoming mayor of New York City.
Especially because the right, I mean, not to get off on track, the right has a Republican candidate, then they have the existing Adams who's running as an independent, he's highly corrupt, and then you have Cuomo who lost, who's also running as an independent, who's just announced. So you have the right split into three. So, and none of them are giving an inch. So it's basically, it's a sealed deal, really.
Well, I don't actually know if you saw that video that Eric Adams' social media team put out not too recently. It was like a day in the life of Eric Adams. Yeah. And they go around shadowing him, and he basically doesn't do anything. He's just going out of his car, into a building, back into his car, into another building. There's nothing that happens. So, I mean, yeah, let's say it's highly likely he's going to win, but he's not actually the mayor yet. But I know you were lauding him slightly earlier, but I am
lauding. I mean, I know shades of gray might confuse and bewilder some, but I think things are more complicated than lauding or condemning.
Okay, you were giving him some praises.
Yes, some praises, yeah.
Okay, you're speaking in his favor.
Yes, okay.
But I'm a bit skeptical.
Yes.
Or maybe more than a bit skeptical.
Yes.
Okay, because he has condemned the Palestinian resistance. He's recognized on multiple occasions Israel's so-called right to exist. He's dignified and responded to these anti-Semitism smears, just like Jeremy Corbyn. And you put out a post actually about that in which you were cautioning him not to fall down the sort of same rabbit hole that Jeremy Corbyn did. So is he not just going along with sort of the liberal establishment frame that he has to continue doing? I mean, how radical, for want of a better word, is his actual candidacy and the policy program that he's putting forward?
Okay, so here's the thing. I think firstly, people probably know this already, but Zohran Mamdani, I mean, people are more than their father or mother, but, you know, Mahmoud Mamdani is a very well-established, I mean, a bit post-colonial theory sort of area, but a very well-recognized anti-colonial scholar. His mother, Mira Nair, is also very much in the left, a filmmaker both from India, but via Uganda. So there's that kind of background to just establish, which I mean, people are more than their background. He also founded about in the Students for Justice in Palestine. He's consistently stood and chanted for BDS. I mean, this is at a time when that was a definite loser. In the late 2018, 2019, 2020, when he became a legislator, a state legislator in 2019. He was also a kind of rank and file member. He wasn't just like AOC who got the endorsement of DSA. He was a rank and file organizer. He was a cadre of DSA, and he was from the left cadre of DSA. He becomes a state legislator, and he introduces basically the first law of its kind that would penalize and would ban charitable status to any charity that was found to have funded any activities in Gaza or West Bank or whatever. So this is we have to remember that New York has the largest proportion of Jews outside of Tel Aviv of any city in the world. So it's sort of, if you're an elected official, that is the terrain upon which you're trying to win democratic elections. And so then he comes out and says, during debates as well, that he would arrest Netanyahu if he ever came to New York.
Which is sort of a meaningless.
Well, whether it's meaningless, phrasal. I mean, at some level, all of this politics when it comes to Israel is meaningless or meaningful. Only it's largely symbolic. Let's just be honest with that. But symbolism matters, especially in its core. And then famously at the debates, they said, why wouldn't you go to Israel? Well, I'm going to just work on New York, when all the other candidates, like lemmings, were like, Israel would be the only place. I love Israel. It was totally deranged, because the question wasn't even about Israel. The question was, where would you go after you become a mayor? So it was, and so that was, a position. I'm saying the good parts here right now. I think I have my criticisms. So he has remained, fairly consistent on these questions. And so he was asked directly, even at the debates, even as the firestorm is coming forward. Oh, Adams has created this task force to create economic activity with Israel. And they ask him, will you continue that program? He's like, I won't continue that program. So he says that explicitly in the middle of the firestorm, right? Then they ask him about globalize the intifada, and he says, the word intifada predates the state of Israel and was used by the Holocaust Museum to describe papers in the Middle East in Arab language newspapers were describing the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as an intifada. And so we have to understand that these words, just because they're Arabic words, we can't then impose our own racist conceptions on them. Very reasonable, but obviously now it's been taken up. And he has never apologized for that. And so that's important. He hasn't apologized for these things. He's always said, he sort of sidesteps it. He doesn't defend it. He's sort of, and then on the question of, do you believe in the state of Israel to exist? Yes. Initially he said, yes, I do. And then later on, he came out, and even in debates, he says, I believe Israel has a right to exist as a state with equal rights. Now, of course, many people, including myself, have a disagreement with the idea that Zionism could ever exist as a state for equal rights. And what does it mean to have equal rights when you have people who have been ghettoized? Does that mean the right of return that's recognized under international law? So there's a lot of questions there. But I think that, and again, I do hate a lot of people that go, oh, the left is too puritanical. The Puritanism is the only thing, it's called principles. And so I don't have any, for me, it's not like I'm defending that position. I'm not being like, oh, don't be too puritanical at all. But I think considering the conditions of living in the US, being born and raised in the US, and really experiencing the politics of the US, being elected in the US, I can say that he is pushing the envelope of what is possible. And I think there's a real value to that you can say you didn't do these things and win, not only win in a landslide against a political dynasty in the largest vote share not vote share in absolute terms, votes in the history of New York. That tells everyone. And it's terrifying. I mean, Saul Alinsky, the organizer in Chicago, famously said, I have a lot of criticisms of him, but he said, he had something like, the action is the reaction. The fact that the entire Zionist establishment is losing their minds and don't know what to do, frauding at the mouth. They all look zombie-faced, googly-eyed. They look crazed. That in itself, to me, is a value here. So, but I do also have, I think that the possibilities that he'll be able to do any of the things that he said other than freezing the rent and doing these grocery store things, which is very minimal, is very unlikely. But saying that, I do think, I mean, they don't have home rule authority in New York City. In different states, there's a thing called home rule authority where different states give greater authority or less authority to municipalities. New York doesn't really. They're basically, it's like being mayor of London, but a little bit more authority than that. And so he has limited authority, but I think with that, there'll be a real scope for disappointment. But
well, I think that's right. I think I'd agree with what you're saying in terms of obviously pushing the envelope, pushing the Overton window in terms of acceptable discourse, and that in itself has a value in the sense that it can open up space for other people. But I also think, I mean, you mentioned this example of him saying that he'd arrest Netanyahu, which would never happen. I mean, he's going to instruct the NYPD. Where are they going to take him? But the point is,
the right to state of Israel exists. Oh, he said it doesn't exist anymore. I guess our work's done here, comrade. The state of Israel doesn't exist anymore. By that extent, none of it matters.
No, but it's not that. It's not just that. But if you also mentioned the fact that there's a very large, not just Jewish, but Zionist population in New York, which is materially involved in supporting the genocide, either through fundraising or sending their own children to go and be active members of the Israel occupation forces, to literally go kill people and then go back to live in New York City, or whether it is people even relocating and becoming full-time colonists in the entity. So New York, as a Western city, probably has one of the greatest relationships with the Zionist regime and materially supporting it. Where, you know, we haven't seen much or anything from Mamdani.
You're making my argument for me.
No, but then why would Mamdani then make this sort of meaningless?
The reason why it's not meaningless is this. Netanyahu visits America. He's sitting around in the Oval, next to the Oval Office, in their conference room. And Netanyahu brings up all these people. What's happening? Oh, this guy, Mamdani. And Trump goes, oh, I'll let him try to arrest you. To me, that is a material impact. I mean, look, in 2008, 2009, my union, UCU, just had a motion to look into BDS, which we've since obviously have BDS as official policy. The Israeli Knesset had a 5-hour emergency meeting about us doing that. So we've moved quite dramatically from that. For me, it's a war of attrition, comrade. It's not a war of annihilation. These things we chip away. We have to chip away. We can't go guns a-blazing because we don't have the guns. I mean these figuratively. What we have is the ability to corrode and erode. It's the first time in American history a majority of Americans in poll after poll, support the Palestinians. And it's a generational divide. Younger people supported by 70, 80, 90% support the Palestinians over Israel. Israel and their ADL and other groups know the time is limited in continuing support from the Americans, because especially now you look at the Epstein stuff, they're based amongst the MAGA right, who they're much more terrified. I mean, Netanyahu visited for 3 days. 2 of those days were spent visiting right influencers and trying to win them over. It's because they're terrified that the base is collapsing there. I mean, they misfired with this Epstein stuff, because the two things that the right care about are state capture by a foreign entity and pedophilia. And he's like, okay, well, this is the whole enchilada here, you know? And so there's no coming back from this. There's no coming back from this for the right. And so the left, obviously, I mean, you might disagree, but historically and in present is obviously hostile towards the state, the settler state. And so it's like, it's only the liberals that are now still really defending, and the center right, I guess. So the center right and the center left, which is the same thing. So the days are numbered, and this is sharpening that contradiction. You could say it's meaningless. By that extent, all of this is meaningless.
The point I was making about the meaningless gesture is that he could have said other things that would have been more meaningful.
Like what?
Well, in terms of what I just mentioned, the material relationship.
So the charity thing is that's the only law in the country that he was the author of when he was in the state legislature. They have the authority to do that. And so, but they couldn't get the votes. I mean, he was just one state legislator. He tried to get the votes. He couldn't get the votes. And it would have made it illegal to be a charity that funded any of the activities in what's called the occupied territories. It's called the occupied territories. Obviously, all of it's occupied, but this is the areas occupied after 1967, which is illegal under international law. But I mean, it's all illegal under international law. Anyways, whatever. What the point I'm trying to say is what's called the occupied territories, not all of historic Palestine, which is called Israel. So I think that to that extent, he's already done the thing that you've said. And legislatively, he's trying to do it. He tried to do it when he was a legislator. Well, he's still a legislator, but.
Well, one thing that we can definitely, I think, agree on about.
And I'm not some Zohran sycophant, by the way. I'm like actually very critical, but I'm like, let's be quite honest about the conditions of what's happening in the U.S. and electoralism. We also might have strong disagreements on the question of electoralism. I'm like, look, in bourgeois society, in advanced capitalist world, we've never had any even potential of a revolution or radical change in society without a direct relationship with bourgeois institutions. Even the Bolshevik Revolution was a direct engagement, and that was like basically a feudal society, a semi-feudal society, a direct relationship with the state and electoralism that was then opening up the new vista of revolutionary politics. So for me, I think disengaging with bourgeois institutions, i.e. the state, and through electoralism, look, politics is a spectator sport in this country. People engage through the ballot box, and that is an avenue that we cannot afford to ignore. We cannot afford to ignore that.
Well, just turning on to our final topic then. This is something you said about Zohran and the generational divide in the United States. We have a sort of an opportunity in the United States, the electoral system, because you have these primaries for fresh faces, young blood, people with dynamism to come up, which we don't really have here in Britain because of the way our establishment parties work and because of just our political system. And we've now seen this proposed new party, which is to be led again, I think, by Jeremy Corbyn, who's now 76 years old. It seems to me that we have the same losers, same failures, proven failures, who are in his inner circle again. I'm not going to start naming names now, but we know who those people are. Who were working in Jeremy Corbyn's office, who were sort of outriders for him, and who catastrophically failed. They made all the bad choices, all the bad calls in, from 2015 until 2019. These are the same people now proposing to create this new party. Do you think it's going to have any legs? Do you think it's actually going to make a material difference? I mean, is it even going to come about? I mean, Jeremy Corbyn still seems to be almost 5 years since he was suspended for the Labour Party, still seems to be equivocating.
Okay, so on this, I would say, firstly, there's a recent poll that has us defeating the Labour Party. Of course, at 15%, but obviously because of the concentration of Labour voters, they would have maybe even 20-30% more seats. It's just one poll, but this new party was at 15%, 50%. Obviously, Reform was the dominant party. So there is definitely appetite. We know this. Even as it's plus or minus 4, there are polls that have consistently putting this new party, the Zahra Sultana, Jeremy Corbyn party, at twice that of at least the Green Party. So that's the first part. So there's definitely a need to have this party. The second part of what you've said is, I think, I think it is true, and I want to say that I don't think the advisors around Jeremy Corbyn acted as a block. While agreeing with a lot of what you've said, there were people, and I think the people around him now, who were, and we know this from the multiple memoirs and autopsies that have been written about what happened, and lots of testimonials from comrades and friends who were around, that the people that are around him now were actually the ones that were pushing to be more direct around the anti-Semitism stuff, were kicked out, actually. Even Chief of Staff were kicked out because they opposed the so-called People's Vote to redo the disastrous People's Vote proposal to redo the Brexit vote. And so to put that out there, I don't think any of these people should be involved in this new party. Let's say, even be generous here and say 60-70% of the attacks and the destruction were outside the control of the decision making of, let's just say that we're part of like media attacks, whatever, material attacks, whatever. Consistently bad decisions made around Corbyn's leadership. Those people should not be leading this. Absolutely. Also, it's so undignified. There should be something called shame. You've made these decisions. You've already been in a position of power. They're like a tiger that's tasted human flesh. You're like, okay, go in the wilderness and eat some rabbits. They're like, no, we need the humans. They've tasted power. They want power. That's all it is. That's all it is. And we know this because Zahra comes out and says this is a party that's going to be co-leader. The reason why it's important to have Jeremy, and I think Zahra as a close second, is important for the left is because it's about infrastructure. The minute they endorse a party and really push that out, I mean, Zahra put out a petition to gather names and contacts. It's over 100,000 people now, and that's in a matter of a couple of weeks. That's not nothing, right? So it's people who are like, we want to be involved in a new party. Here's our contact details. That's a power move, and it's good that she did that. I think that leadership, let's put leadership in inverted commas because nobody's elected them yet. So there needs to be some kind of democracy. This can't be a repeat of Labourism where you're superimposing and parachuting people. There has to be a cultural shift where actual democracy, where actual people have some say in it and some buy-in, not just like the Sierra Club where we just like pay our dues and shut up and take it. So that leadership needs to be Jeremy Corbyn and Zahra Sultana and others, because that adds legitimacy. And that legitimacy means 10 to 20,000 members almost immediately will join pay dues. That's 3 to 4 offices in 3 to 4 cities with 3 to 4 staff to start building a membership. That is the nuts and bolts of building a party. You start off strong with that. Right now we have a million parties, a million fractures, a million infighting. The problem is these advisors don't want to give up. Their only avenue to power is through kind of like Lady Macbeth,
But
like
Jeremy
whispering into
Corbyn-
Jeremy. Let's put Jeremy to one side.
But no,
I
but
think-
it's important because if Jeremy Corbyn is most likely going to be the leader of this outfit,
Well, leader.
he's the person who ultimately has the say.
But that's
in who's
why.
around
But
him.
that's why the Zahra Sultana thing has happened. She made the move. She made a power move, and I respect her for that. And she said, no, this is nonsense. We're not going to have the same advisors. We're just interested in accumulated power. They have a libidinal relationship to power. It's sadistic. It's sadistic. They're just like they're money hungry people. You know, CEOs are money hungry. They're power hungry. So they're just hungry for power. And so they have a rump. There's no power here. There's nothing even created. There's no name. There's a rump. And that rump, they don't even want to reduce their influence over this rump. They think it's a fiefdom. It's a rump. And they're like, we're going to blow up this rump. That's why the leaks happened. Who did the leaks? Who could have done the leaks? I don't know. Unless you're an idiot, you don't know who the leaks came from. We all know who the leaks came from. And it's the same people who are around Jeremy, and they see that their influence is diminishing if it's a co-leadership. And that means that they're like, we want to detonate all this. We don't care. We don't want nothing. We'd rather have nothing than have a party where we're not running the show.
So in 60 seconds,
Yeah.
can we really be optimistic about this then?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I think, look, the Greens led by Zach Polanski, of course, lots of problems with him historically, but I think he's on the right path now. The Greens have a built-in constituency that's 5% across the country. They got second in 37 seats. You know, the point is that 5%, we need a sort of red-green alliance where they can run people in certain places. The projection has it that they'll lose their urban seats anyways. So there's seats that they can take from the Tories. And the left party takes seats from the Labour. And we have a red-green alliance where we kind of have a coalition, and we have a set of principles on internationalism, on the welfare state, on nationalization, some core principles that we don't budge on. The problem with the Greens is they can say all kinds of nice things that the Lib Dems did in 2010. And then when it comes to the positions of power, they're like, well, we want LTNs everywhere, low traffic neighborhoods, some nonsense parties. So they have great on paper, but when it comes to negotiations, we're going to get screwed. But I don't think Zach Polanski and Motan Ali, who's running for deputy, if they become leaders, and I think I would encourage people to support them if you're a member of the Green Party, that they will budge on this, because those are the people that got them elected, right? And those are the politics upon which they got elected. And so I think a red-green alliance is crucial. I think a left party, the problem with left parties, sorry, this is only 60 seconds. The problem with left parties and left, center, left kind of green coalitions is if you look at La France Insoumise in France, look at the Left Bloc in Portugal, look at the Communist Party and the Congress Party in India, because the left will, if you tell the left and their cater, vote for this sort of more soft, squishy left party because they're part of a coalition, they will do it because it's something more than just themselves, their NIMBYism, their neighborhood, what affects them. You ask the center party to do that, or the kind of more squishy left to do it for the hard left party, they don't do it. And so we lose out in those coalitions, but I think it's necessary, because if that 4 or 5% that consistently vote for the Greens don't vote for the Greens and compete with us, we will go from potentially 30 seats to like 10 seats, potentially, or 50 seats to 20 seats. The proportion is huge, and so the impact is huge. So I think, long story short, I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic. When we lose, when we win, I'm like, we're building power. When we lose, I'm like, we're sharpening the contradictions. But I think we need revolutionary hope and optimism while being realistic to actually build capacity and win.
Was it Gramsci who said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will?
Indeed.
So that's the vein which we have to continue.
Absolutely.
I would say that I'm more cautious than optimistic about it, but I just think that if they continue with the same people, same advisors, same trajectory, same culture of briefing to the right-wing press, indulging these anti-Semitism claims, everything they did previously, then it's doomed to failure. And I think that
Agreed.
is something that people need to be aware of. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. So thank you very much, Dr. Ashok Kumar, Associate Professor, I should say, actually, for joining me today. And thank you very much to all of our viewers for watching this debut episode. And we'll see you on the next one.